Today, we are talking about the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts and military activities, and specifically about the impact that war in Ukraine could have on environment. And I'm very glad to welcome Doug Weir, Research and Policy Director at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Good morning, Doug. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good, thank you.
Doug, I want to start with a question that probably many of our readers want to ask. Is the environment the silent victim of this war?
Yeah, I think often the environment comes fairly low down the list of priorities and conflicts. It's not as silent as once it was. We can do far more remotely to monitor environmental damage. And I think particularly in a conflict like that in Ukraine obviously has well-developed domestic capacity around environmental monitoring, assessment, and insistence. So in that respect, the environment is perhaps probably more visible in this conflict than in many others. And that's also a reflection of the severity and seriousness of some of the environmental risks that are associated with it.
What do you think is the worst impact on climate right now in Ukraine?
Biggest issue on climate, I think you probably need to step back, I guess, and look at what this conflict and the geopolitical situation it has created is going to do for global efforts to address the climate crisis. We've seen IPCC reports come out during this conflict, which under normal circumstances would have been headline news, which had been pushed down the news agenda because of this. We've seen the sort of momentum from COP26 diminish somewhat. Very few people are talking about climate change. At the same time, we've seen some interesting developments around energy security questions in Europe and reliance on fossil fuels and these sort of questions. So I think in terms of climate change in this conflict specifically, it's almost these higher order questions which, it's raised.
Do you feel that some regions of Ukraine, like Eastern Ukraine at Donbas region, with massive buildup of industry, are more problematic in terms of the climate impact of the war?
I think the industrial, so Ukraine is a very heavily industrialized country, right? And most of the cities have significant industrial infrastructure in and around them, often in quite close proximity to residential areas. We've seen a direct strategy of targeting these sites. These sites have been caught up in the conflict in other ways. For example, the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, which has become this last holdout for Ukrainian defenders of the city. And we've also seen sort of targeting of other sort of civilian infrastructure sites like distribution centers, for example. And these have short-term climate impacts through fires in particular, through generation of atmospheric pollution. And in addition, obviously, there's the climate footprint of how the war is being fought. So the aircraft which are in the air, the vehicles. But I think, our primary concern at the moment around these sites is pollution issues. And these are potentially long-term pollution issues. For example, some of the oil refineries and oil storage sites that have been struck. Significant fears of pollution around these sites. And the picture we tend to see from conflicts is that because the environment is a relatively low priority, because post-conflict governments have a whole suite of competing priorities to address, environmental cleanup, environmental remediation tends to come pretty far down the line. So in some of these cases, this pollution which we're seeing from these sites may well be very long-term indeed.
You mentioned the governments, and I'm wondering if you feel that policymakers often overlook and underestimate, the impacts that wars and conflicts have on the environment. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. It's it's getting better. I was at a governmental meeting this week, and that was specifically focused on the environmental issues associated with this conflict. The governments who spoke were extremely well briefed on it. We've seen a lot more attention. I think organizations like ours and many others who are doing monitoring both within Ukraine and remotely have helped to get the environment onto the agenda. And then we've seen very serious issues like the Russian occupation of the Chernobyl site, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And these have really brought these questions of environmental damage to the fore in the context of this conflict, I think. So it varies a lot between conflicts, but I think because of the nature of this conflict and because what we're seeing in Ukraine now is almost a continuation from an environmental narrative from what we've seen for the last 8 years in Eastern Ukraine, which was fighting in the Donbas region, which is incredibly intensely industrialized, that almost the groundwork was there and the narrative was already prepared before the conflict started. And what we've seen has been a continuation of that. So we're relatively happy with the sort of level of scrutiny in the environment for this conflict. But that obviously, what we're seeing is still a lot of environmental damage. There's always a question of what comes next in terms of how the conflict develops, and also in terms of how that environmental damage is addressed in future. And as ever, it shows up the weakness of the legal framework and normative framework that should be in place to protect the environment during conflict. And that needs a great deal of work, and also wider questions around accountability for environmental damage or reparations for environmental damage as well, which is, again, a very underdeveloped field.
Obviously, we don't know how much of all these weapons that are being used in the war in the Ukraine will leave behind. But do you have a rough estimate how long it will take for the environment in Ukraine to recover after this war?
I think it's very difficult to say. We can point to earlier examples. Look at the First World War. There are still areas of France and Belgium where you can't farm because of the presence of unexploded ordnance and heavy metal contamination in the soil. You see the landscape disruption from the trenches still in place, and that's what, a century later. We could look to the 1991 Gulf War and the huge oil well fires we had there. Work to remediate contaminated coastlines in Saudi Arabia is still ongoing, and that was in 1991. So often the damage which we see in conflicts can be very long-lasting indeed. And this is particularly the case where there isn't sufficient assistance post-conflict to actually address those environmental problems. And if we look at some of the pollution issues around some of these sites in Ukraine, many of them are old industrial facilities. There was contamination before the conflict. Now there's extra layers of contamination, pollution on top. Environmental remediation is astonishingly expensive. And if you're a government faced with a choice of supporting rebuilding, recovering and housing for your people versus spending huge costs on environmental remediation, you're obviously going to choose looking after and directly caring and sheltering your population, even where there might be long-term health or ecological risks from that pollution. So it's reasonable to expect that the damage which we're seeing now may well be around for decades.
I know that you have mentioned before some of the impacts that probably Ukraine will face in the next couple of years in terms of the environment. But if I ask you, which do you think will be the worst impact of this war on the environment? Do you think that probably air pollution and all these toxic remnants of war will be worse in the Ukraine? Which do you think will be the worst one?
It's difficult to say. I mean, there are different ways to answer this question, right? We can look at internationally what's the most severe environmental impact from this conflict, and that we can see the kind of disruption to global environmental governance, be it on climate change response or biodiversity crisis or whatever, and the impact that the geopolitical context of this conflict has created internationally. We could look specifically within Ukraine itself in terms of the direct damage caused by the fighting, and that may be some of the pollution problems and damage which we see in cities and around industrial areas. But we could also look at it in another way, looking at what is the impact on environmental governance within Ukraine from this conflict, and how much of the government's capacity for environmental governance will be knocked out by this conflict or weakened by this conflict. And that has a potential to impact all environmental issues in Ukraine, and potentially for many years as well, because the government will be dealing with a whole range of other issues.